Welcome back. Panelists here. Syndicated columnist George Will, MSNBC political analyst Elise Jordan, Danielle Pletka of the American Enterprise Institute, and Joshua Johnson, host of 1A and NPR. All right, Danielle, you are international affairs expert, so since we are actually talking about policy with Russia, I'll give you the first shot at this. It was interesting to hear Ron Johnson call him an unfriendly adversary. You have made the case that the administration is tough. What about the president? Does that matter?
So one of the things that troubles me about the whole discussion on Russia is that when someone in the administration does something bad, we all say, hey, the president owns that, his administration, this is the Trump administration. When the administration does something good on Russia, all of a sudden it's Trump probably disagrees with this. No, that doesn't happen in an administration. You do not expel 60 diplomats. You do not impose sanctions. You do not do the things the Trump administration has done if the president isn't okay with it. What he thinks in his heart of hearts, I have honestly no idea. But I think the administration has represented a stronger line on Russia policy than the Obama administration did.
Joshua, the argument that some will make, though, is the president without the rhetorical backbone, that Putin sees it as a wink.
Might see it as a wink. I mean, and part of what I am concerned about is not just the rhetoric of it, but how this will resolve itself. I mean, there's kind of only two ways that this can go. It can get better, it can get worse. And so if the president and Mr. Putin are not the ones to relieve some of the tension, who will it be? Maybe somebody that both of them have dealings with, maybe business dealings with. So you look at the countries that say Russia does the most business with: Belarus, not a big international player; Germany, a big international player, but not someone that the president gets along with; and China, number one import origin, number two export destination. So it opens the door for someone else to save the day, for another rising power to possibly come in and say, guys, calm down, I will handle this. Nature hates a vacuum, and part of this opens the door for, I think, different kinds of destabilization that, just as an American, leave me wondering, what does this mean for me? Where does this go from here?
We're not in charge. That's essentially his argument.
My guess is that Putin is really profoundly uninterested in tweets. He strikes me as someone interested in tanks and little green soldiers and all that stuff. The fact is, Putin is dismembering a European nation, geographically, the largest European nation, Ukraine. And this is a serious business. The late Scoop Jackson, 30 years ago, said of the Soviet Union, it's like a burglar walking down a hotel corridor, trying the doorknobs, and when he finds one that's unlocked, he goes in. If he decides that the Baltic states are unlocked doors, and he reads the polls in Europe that show diminishing support for Article 5 of the NATO agreement, that is, that an attack on one is an attack on all, that's when it will get seriously dangerous.
Elise, I had a producer friend of me saying, sounds like the president is leading from behind on Russia. I'm sure that phrase is not one he would like to hear.
Well, and also in Syria, you look at the sudden announcement this week that he wants to withdraw all of our troops from Syria. It was something that just left his own national security apparatus just flabbergasted, because although he might think that way, and they know that he thinks that way, the timing wasn't there for necessarily how the strategy is going to be implemented. What I find so amazing, that looking at Donald Trump and Russia, the great unsolved mystery of his administration is why he might get tougher, but his rhetoric is still going to be very friendly towards Vladimir Putin, and that's something that his own administration, people who work for him, don't even understand.
Is it fair to say, let's see what John Bolton does in 2 months and then see where the president's rhetoric is, Danielle?
Well,
or not?
It's certainly interesting to see that he has chosen two new national security people without regard to their very tough views on Russia. That suggests to us that perhaps he's comfortable with that. We want the president to change his rhetoric, but at a certain point you do have to choose what matters more, the rhetoric or the action. And I'm for action all the way.
Well, we've been going back to literally, seriously, rhetoric, action, right, with Trump. I want to move to his cabinet. You have two cabinet secretaries I'm going to point out. You have Shulkin, the Veterans Affairs Secretary, and we're going to talk to him in a few minutes. Policy disagreements and an ethical violation. Scott Pruitt, lots of ethical issues, but no policy disagreements. Joshua Johnson, one's in office and one isn't.
Exactly.
What's that tell you?
Well, I think, I know I sound like a broken record. Every time we've talked about this, I kind of say the same thing. But the president tends to run the Trump administration the way he ran the Trump organization. He likes to have an inner circle of people who agree with him very solidly, who further his policy line, who don't get out of that line, and who make him look good. I think in that regard, especially if David Shulkin's arguments about why he was removed, about the concerns over the V8 are to be believed, to me that kind of makes sense, and it's starting to get to the point where the policy moves in the administration touch people in real ways. I mean, the VA is keeping my father alive.
Right.
So this is one of those parts of the government where I think, at least for me, I kind of sit up a little straighter and say, wait a minute, why are you going? Is this about a $31,000 dinner set? Or is this about decisions that actually keep people who serve the country alive?
You've conflated your dinner set with Carson. That's the wrong, with Wimbledon tickets. Sorry. Ben Carson is the $31,000 dining room set.
So hard to
I understand. So, George, there's something about Scott Pruitt, though. While I think he's been cheerleading well for the deregulation front, is he becoming Icarus? I want to throw up a few headlines. There's the negative that he's gotten. First-class travel distinguishes Scott Pruitt's EPA tenure. Then there's the EPA chief, Pruitt, is said to be eyeing Attorney General job, floating himself for new jobs. And then, of course, now we learn about him renting a residence from the wife of an energy lobbyist. And they've made a clarification to say, well, she's not lobbied in the last 2 years.
Well, Mr. Pruitt offends the sensibilities of lots of people in Washington, and he doesn't care. He was an attorney general. He was the leader of the 27, I think, Republican attorneys general who made lots of progress suing the previous administration. So he is, for reason, a hero to the conservative movement. And he is doing what the president wants to be done, which is what he's there to do.
Right. I talked to somebody in the White House that there is an exhaustion, though, at how many Pruitt ethics articles they're going to get. This one's a harder one for them to defend.
Well, it's just another line of coverage that happens with so many of these cabinet secretaries, and everyone is exhausted by all of these ethical violations. And Scott Pruitt certainly really seems to have risen to the forefront of being out there with his private travel, with his security details because someone was mean to him once on a flight, with staying at this incredible rate that if anyone ever wanted to extend to me in D.C., wow, that would be great, friends like that. So I think that this the tolerance level is pretty low.
I do think the president believes what George said about him, which is that he's getting picked on a little bit. And that, for now, it probably gives him some job security. Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and then click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.